Hello, everyone, and welcome to our book conversation today on Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians by our friend and colleague, Professor Atalia Omer. We are so lucky to have Professor Omer with us and also our distinguished respondents, Dr. Sara Roy and Rabbi Brant Rosen, whom I will introduce momentarily. I'm Diane Moore, and I am a lecturer in religion, conflict, and peace on the faculty at the Harvard Divinity School, and I have the privilege of being the lead scholar on the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, which is sponsoring this event. I will introduce our panelists, and then Professor Omer will speak for a few moments on the book with just bringing those up to speed who may have not had a chance to read it yet, but the themes that she's addressed. And then Rabbi Rosen will respond for a few minutes, then Dr. Roy will respond, and then the three of them will have a conversation about what has transpired in their remarks and to further discuss the central tenets of what this remarkable book brings forward and implies for our contemporary situation. The last 15 minutes will be devoted to responding to questions from you. So let me now turn to introducing our speaker and author and our distinguished respondents, and then I will step away and have us move right into the conversation. So Professor Atalia Omer is Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Studies and at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She earned her PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Politics in November of 2008 from the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University, and her research focuses on religion, violence, and peace building, as well as theories and methods in the study of religion. She is a 2017 Andrew Carnegie Fellow working on a book tentatively entitled "We Cannot Eat Peace, Tweeter Prophets and the Harmony Business." I can't wait for a webinar on that one when that comes out. So Professor Omer is also a senior scholar and fellow here for the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative, and it is just wonderful to have you with us, and congratulations on this important volume. Dr. Sara Roy is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, specializing in the Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Roy is also co-chair of the Middle East Seminar, jointly sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and co-chair of the Middle East Forum at the Center for the Middle East Studies. Her most recent book is The Gaza Strip, the Political Economy of De-Development. And Dr. Roy is also a faculty affiliate to the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. And thank you, Dr. Roy, for being with us.
Okay.
And Rabbi Brant Rosen is the founder of Tzedek Chicago, a non-Zionist Jewish congregation based on the core values of justice, anti-racism, and solidarity with the oppressed, including Palestinians. His project is a book of new Jewish prayers for Shabbat, holidays, and other sacred occasions. Written in English, this prayer book will create a new idiom for Jewish liturgy reflecting values of liberation, the prophetic imperative to speak truth to power, and a diaspora-based vision that views the entire world as the Jewish homeland. And Rabbi Brant is a non-resident fellow with the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative this year. So welcome to you, Rabbi. And again, I'll turn this conversation now over to all three of you, and thank you again for being with us, and thank all participants who are with us here in the webinar for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Diane, for the introduction and for moderating, and thank you, Sara and Brant, for taking the time to read and reflect on the book. So my training, as Diane mentioned, is in religion, politics, and ethics from Harvard, but I've been working at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame for now over 12 years. And speaking to other scholars and practitioners working within the field of peace studies, I take the case of American Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, as well as American Jewish critics of Israel who are located on various places along the spectrum from Zionist to non-Zionist and anti-Zionist. So I take this case as an example of the importance of focusing on narratives and narrativity as critical sites for thinking about questions of peace, justice, and social movement work. This opens up a space for the humanities and arts, which are often excluded from realist underpinnings of peace and conflict studies. As a religious studies scholar, I also ask specific questions about how religion intersects with such narratives of, or broadly about religion and ideological formations. So asking such a question then has implications for protest, social action, and reimagining or rewriting political and social scripts. My research also illuminates that the processes of self-interrogation and transformation many American Jews, whom I trace in the book, undergo are both relational and intersectional. By relational, I mean contending with a specific Jewish sinfulness against the Palestinians and an embrace of the charge to inhabit the days of awe relentlessly through social protests and actions of civil disobedience in some instances. By intersectional, I mean together with the people who inhabit the social movement under consideration in the book, the deepening recognition of and grappling with the interlinking of the Palestinian struggle with other struggles and with the legacy of anti-Semitism and a broader analysis of anti-racism, feminism, white supremacy, exploitative capitalism, and well, modernity writ large. In the second part of the book, I examine the products, so to speak, of the relational and intersectional grassroots meaning making, which I examine redescriptively in the earlier chapters, which constitute the first part of the book. So the second part offers a snapshot of a response to the question, what kind of Jewishness is articulated by the Jewish-Palestine solidarity movement? This opens a path for a theoretical questioning concerning how does social movement participate in re-articulating religiosity. In the third part of the book, most pronouncedly, I link the process of reimagining Jewishness to an intersectional scrutiny of American race history and the participation of some Jews in white privilege and apparatuses of white supremacy, by tracing their efforts to decolonize anti-Semitism and grapple with what James Baldwin identified as the moral choice of American Jews to become white. The people I engaged for this work interrogated the scene of the occupation and in the process deepened their engagement not only with how they are implicated with the occupation of Palestinians, but also with their white privilege and their complicity with global and local structures of oppression more broadly. So this is a book about their effort to make a different moral choice. Cumulatively, this movement, which I trace, contributes to reshaping American Jewish community from the ground up. At this point, I should say that the study is based on ethnographic work, interviews with over 100 Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, and other methodologies with which I triangulated my findings. So not merely performing a cultural prophetic function, the social movement itself becomes a religio-cultural space as indicated by multiple activists I interviewed and who found coherence and intelligibility of their Jewish and ethical compasses therein, within the movement space, which is a kind of a prefigurative space, a coherence they themselves rescripted. So the move toward critical, what I call critical resistance, involves refiguring Jewishness as other-centric rather than ethnocentric. This is where critical caretaking comes in. So critical caretaking, which is what Brant Rosen does in Tzedek Chicago, which is a values-based synagogue, which he founded, critical caretaking is a concept I developed to describe, in this case, a praxis that focuses not only on the instrumentalist question of what religion can do to socio-political mobilization through providing protest repertoire, for example, But by also looking multidirectionally at the inverse, what does social movement activism do for religion? In the case I examine in the book, critical caretaking means unlearning blood and land-centric conceptions of peoplehood and interrelated ethnocentric conceptions of liberation. Instead, Jewish critics stand metaphorically in front of the burning bush and recommit to an intersectional conception of liberation. So what can be understood as a prophetic intervention demands the tools of post-colonial and decolonial critique and vice versa. And so in Days of Awe, I show that isolating religion as a distinct sphere of analysis reproduces racialized and colonial discourses. And I show, together with all my interlocutors in the movement, the need to decolonize and deorientalize hegemonic accounts of tradition and modern Jewish histories, because once again, the level of narrative and re-narrating or telling a different story is a critical site for conflict analysis, as well as constructively for transforming violent structures and ideologies which authorize the very concrete and violent experiences that the occupation means on the ground for Palestinians. So before I conclude, I wanted to read just very brief sections from the 6th chapter of the book, where I look at what kind of Jewishness is imagined or reimagined from within that space of the social movement. Given that Judaism constitutes a matrix of subject formation, critically refiguring it requires literacy in Jewish traditions and historical memories, which function as one crucial source of authority in the process of disputation of norms and communal practices. It also involves appealing to other sources of moral authority, which are embedded in relationality and the ethical work of atonement and emphatic indignation. Therefore, the scope of interpreting Jewish resources is significantly expanded within a social movement that seeks to rescript communal boundaries. Hence, the question, why not relinquish tradition altogether for the sake of promoting social justice, relies on the absurd and decidedly modernist presumption that people who are Jewish might just as well cease to be Jewish. The case of Jewishness and its complex relation to peoplehood is particularly instructive because Jewish modes of identification could never easily be classified in modernist terms of belief in a set of propositions. Instead, they always also articulated themselves in particular historical, sociocultural, and collective ways that embodied both secular and religious frames. Hence, reclaiming atheistic Buddhism is just as authentic a case of Jewish hermeneutical or interpretive retrieval as reclaiming the legacy of the biblical prophets. When these strands appear together, they generate what I have called prophetic pastiche. They also illuminate the complex causality of by religions that can be transformative in the world. My use of the concept of prophetic pastiche conveys that the prophetic stance and retrieval activists embodied in communal and activist spaces constitute, as in art, an eclectic imitation of prophetic style for the purpose of reclaiming and transforming it. It likewise denotes how their activism, influenced by multiple forces, participates in the proliferation of the meanings of the prophetic through intertextuality. As the activists' social, cultural, political, and religious texts are shaped significantly through the grammars and semiotic landscapes of a broader social movement. Hence, the pastiche is not mere imitation, but retains a sense of parody and eclecticism with a critical and self-transformative edge. This act of transcendence in activists resolved to resist the occupation, even with their own bodies and sacrificing their own safety. Jewish Palestine solidarity activism is deeply personal. in reimagining what it means to be Jewish. Its forcefulness and resolve to put bodies on the ground are propelled not just by atonement and solidarity, but also by a commitment to a diasporist, joyful, and humanistic Jewishness. I observed activists deriving spiritual meanings from explicitly Jewish spaces, and in the process of working for Palestine solidarity, reconfiguring these spaces. I also highlighted how promoting this struggle requires a hermeneutical discursive work that cannot simply theorize Jewishness out of existence. Indeed, it requires opening up spaces for agentic, innovative work on identity and narrative, because the epicenter of the oppression of Palestinians is that of narrativity formed through epistemic and discursive violence. So this chapter focused specifically on the making and unmaking of meaning, a process necessary for Jewish activists who wish to operate within explicitly Jewish spaces as they reimagine the very contours of their collective identity. This dialogic process involves not only accessing and reclaiming a supposedly more authentic Jewish narrative and message of powerlessness, but also centrally it demands grappling relationally and intersectionally with the historical ramifications of Jewish power. And I'll end here.
Thank you, Atalia. Before I speak and respond, I just want to thank Diane and RCPI, Harvard Divinity School, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's truly an honor. And I'm excited about these ideas and the opportunity to have this public conversation. I'm coming at this not primarily as an academic. I'm coming at this as someone for whom being a congregational rabbi has been my profession for most of my adult life. And one of the things that I appreciated about Atalia's work is the way that she was able to give me a framework, sort of an overall framework to understand what on earth I was going through. In the creation of and the founding of my new congregation, which felt like a very natural evolution and sort of a progress through my own grappling with narrative, with the Jewish narrative, really able to understand how these issues, how social movements dovetailing with religion, how narrative informs religion, and the concept of critical caretaking, which has been enormously important to me in my work now. I very much appreciated having that frame. So when I read Atalia's book and saw her, the way she rendered the founding and formation of Tzedek Chicago, it really, there were many light bulbs going off for me that were able to connect dots that I hadn't seen before. So I just want to say a few things about Atalia's work from my perspective. I'm really happy to talk about anything I raise or anything else that is of interest to folks. But, you know, it seems to me that the notion of narrative has been enormously important for me personally as a Jew, and as an American Jew growing up in the 20th century. Israel and Zionism was just such a major central part of that narrative. And it never occurred to me how much Zionism really subverted or radically changed the previous Jewish narrative that had been in place for really centuries. The notion of Jewish nation statism and lifting that up as a central value. And really not just from a political point of view, but also from religious imperative point of view. You know, I grew up like many American Jews, where I prayed in a sanctuary where there was an Israeli flag next to the Aron Kodesh, next to the Ark where the Torah was kept. The prayer for the state of Israel was a regular part of our prayer services. When I was growing up in religious school, raising money for the state of Israel was seen as a sacred imperative. So in a way, that was a kind of a fusion that I took for granted. and a narrative I took for granted, but it was also a narrative that had tensions built into it, at least for me. When I became a congregational rabbi and my own evolution on this issue started to challenge that narrative, I began to realize how untenable it was to work within a congregation, a liberal congregation that lifted up the values of inclusion, that all points of view are welcome, we're inclusive, we're comfortable, we want everybody to have a voice. But when it came to Israel-Palestine, we could see the fallacy of that approach. And I'll just say, without going into great detail, that for me, a major turning point, finally, or maybe the final straw, was in 2008, 2009, with Israel's military assault on Gaza, which I finally found myself on the other side of that narrative. And by that, I mean Israel as oppressor, Palestinians in the Jewish place now as the oppressed, not seeing Zionism as the liberation movement of the Jewish people, but Zionism as embodied by the state of Israel as a militarized form of state violence against one particular people who inhabited this land. It suddenly became very clear to me, and that became my primary narrative, that standing in solidarity was a mitzvah, as we would say it in Jewish language. It was a sacred obligation. If my spiritual tradition taught that we stand with the oppressed, which is something I had been taught from time immemorial, then it was just perfectly natural at that point on. The problem was I was in a congregation where not everybody had held on to that Jewish narrative, and trying to respect all narratives in such a setting, we tried for many years, and to my congregation's credit, they tried really hard to make this work, where we could create quote unquote safe space where everybody could hold on to their own narratives. It wasn't critical caretaking by any stretch. It was obvious that my spiritual narrative was actually, I would say, sacrilegious and obscene to many members of my congregation. It was one thing for me to politically speak out in favor of Palestinians. And maybe on some level, people could understand that I was speaking my conscience as a political person. But when I started creating religious rituals, when on Tisha B'Av, I rewrote parts of the Book of Lamentations, the holiday where we commemorate the destruction of the temple, on the way that causeless, baseless hatred was the cause of this destruction. When I used this as a day of lamentation for what we have become, embodied by the state of Israel and oppressing another people, that was really a bridge too far for many, many people, giving spiritual, religious language to the social movement that I had become a part of. So, when I left the congregation, I didn't really know if I didn't really know if there was a place where we could create this new narrative in a Jewish communal sense, a spiritual communal sense. Although I didn't realize at the time that we were already, me and other rabbis who were my comrades in this work, many of them in the Jewish Voice for Peace, Rabbinical Council, and others who left the congregation when I left, we started getting together informally and realized pretty quickly that we were not only just creating a place where we could be Jewish and feel comfortable being Jewish together, but we were really creating a new kind of Jewish narrative and a new kind of Judaism. And in a way, not only decoupling Judaism and Zionism, which of course is enormously important, but also many of these other things that Atalia was talking about. The notion of repentance and tshuva, which is something we're thinking a great deal about this particular season as the high holidays are upon us. That when we think collectively about what are the misdeeds that we need to atone for, that the oppression of the Palestinians needs to be front and center. This oppression that is occurring in our name, seeing solidarity with the oppressed and lifting up the oppression of Palestinians, which is being done in our name. And then also this focus on diasporism that Atalia talked about, and that's, I think I'll stop there, really emerged out of a wrestling with what has Judaism been prior to the founding of the state and the onset of political Zionist ideology, namely a religion that was born in the diaspora, that was a religion that was born out of a struggle to how to live meaningfully in exile, in galut, quote unquote, and finding God wherever we go. How can we reclaim what was so basic and foundational to Judaism, but both going back and carrying it forward? Because in the 21st century, the concept of diaspora now is much more complicated. It's also, we don't and shouldn't understand it as uniquely Jewish. So finding a new diasporist-focused Judaism where the world itself is our homeland, where the land of Israel has very important symbolic spiritual importance in Jewish tradition, but in terms of the nitty-gritty of where we make our home and the communities that we found and the way we understand home, being able to dig deeper into what the God in exile might mean and what diaspora could and should mean for us as Jews. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sara, but again, looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I'd like to just start out by saying that I am very grateful to have been invited here and to comment on this book. I found it to be a profoundly insightful and important examination of not only of Jewish solidarity with Palestinians, but of Judaism and the directions in which we are all headed. I decided, there are many ways I could comment on this book. There's a lot to say, but I decided that I would come to this discussion as somebody who, as a scholar and activist, as somebody who participated in activism in a generation that preceded the one that you're focusing on, Atalia. I decided I would just raise 2 points. As I said, there are many things I'd like to say. But the first point, is one of context, and I say this not at all as criticism of this very excellent book, but as something to think about, as a point that I think people need to remember. And by context, I refer to the foundation that was laid by people, by Jews, by Jewish activists, scholars, and others who preceded the young generation of Jewish activists that you talk about in your book. And one can go back more generations than just mine, but I'm going to limit what I say to my own, or the people who participated with me and others in addressing Israel and the Palestinian issue at a time when criticizing Israel and defending Palestinian rights was very difficult, for which there was little context. I can't say there wasn't any context, there was. But when I started in the mid-'80s and worked with people who preceded me, who spoke out in the 70s, and those who joined me then, or whom I joined then, and onward, there's a whole foundation, context that we widened. We didn't create it. It was created for us. We widened it. And who made, I think, made it legitimate to criticize Israel, made it legitimate to criticize Zionism. And through the very difficult and painstaking process and struggle that we all went through, we learned a great deal about the struggle, about the nature of the struggle, about what it means to be Jewish, how we define our Judaism, what for us is the right narrative or authentic Judaism, what strategies we learned, and just how painful this process was, not only for us in some ways, although it was very important, but we came to understand how painful it was for the people who disagreed with us. And in that, there was a very important lesson too. Now, I fully acknowledge that, in your book, you state that the activism that we see today among young Jews didn't happen overnight. It didn't occur in a vacuum. But I think going forward, I think it's very important, or at least I feel very strongly, that one can't really understand or fully understand the activism that we see today and many of the very, very critical issues that you raise around that without understanding or having a better understanding of what people, Jewish activists and scholars went through prior, and what we learned through our struggle, through raising these issues, through defending Palestinian rights, through criticizing Israel and Israeli policies at a time when there was so much opposition to that. And there are a whole range of names I could list of individuals. It's not just a movement, but individuals who played a defining and pivotal role in this process, and who, again, widened the context, widened the space for the kind of activism that we see today. In fact, and these people weren't just people involved in politics. There were people involved in the arts. There were writers. There were religious figures, scholars, activists. There was a whole range. But there's a series of names I could list that I feel, at least, are defining, and without whom and without whose work and struggle and contribution, the activism we see today would not have been possible. So, Jewish activists today, young Jews today, are part of a continuum. We're all part of a continuum. And I think that continuum needs to be understood. They need to be contextualized, and the issues that you raise need to be contextualized within a larger continuum. Now, for example, one community or one part of the Jewish community that a long time ago spoke out and raised these issues were Holocaust survivors and children of survivors. A lot of people don't know that. And of course, they were in a minority within their own community, but nonetheless, there were Holocaust survivors and their children who raised these issues at a time when it seemed impossible for people to do so, or it was considered heresy within the Jewish community to do so. So those individuals were very important to me and to others in catalyzing, a movement that has obviously grown and expanded over time, which is absolutely wonderful. Now, having said that, and there's certainly a lot more to say on that, but having said that, what I find so important about your book and your research is that you are talking about a generation of Jews that, in a sense, take this struggle to the next phase and to the next stage, and that phase or stage or whatever, they're taking their activism further and connecting it or embedding it in a framework of co-resistance, a framework that, as you describe, is multi-ethnic, multiracial, anti-colonial, feminist, and that challenges sites of oppression wherever they exist. So it shows very clearly and very compellingly where Jewish activism stands today and the issues and problems surrounding it, but takes the work that was done previously or the issues raised and the struggles and takes it to the next step or the next stage, which is incredibly important. And the second point I'd like to raise, and I just would, just throw this out there. There are achievements, no doubt, and you describe them very well and very analytically, but I think it's very important not to overstate what has been achieved by Jewish activists, as important as those achievements are. And the challenges, I think it's very important to be very clear about the challenges that continue to exist. We all face immense barriers going forward. So my question, and this is one that I think about a lot, is what are the limitations of Jewish solidarity activism around Palestine, and how can they be addressed going forward? You point to one, I think, that is very important in your discussion of the Ethiopian-Israeli social activist Efrat Yerdeh, who asked, what about Ethiopian Jews yearning for Zion? Now, admittedly, she was speaking, or it appeared that she speaks to her own marginality as a Black woman within a Zionist movement that is largely European and white. A critical issue, of course, that needs to be directly confronted. But her question also points to another problem, in my view, and that is, how will Jewish activism going forward deal with those parts of the Jewish community, still the majority, whether they be young or old, for whom Israel remains important and central to their understanding of Judaism and to their identity as Jews? Is there a way to reconcile the two? The question that we commonly ask is, which side are you on? And I'm wondering, is this the only or even the right question to ask? How will young activists deal with alternative views that are deeply held and deeply held as their own? And how will they deal with internal dissent, which is, of course, inevitable? So there I'll end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I guess I see that we don't have a lot of time, but maybe I can address. Yeah. Well, I just want to affirm, absolutely underscore the points that Sara made about the broader and the deeper historical context of the contemporary moment of young, mostly young Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, and also people. I mean, the spectrum is broader than just people who define themselves explicitly as Palestine solidarity activists. I agree that a more extensive study needs to be in place to illuminate those connections and the depths of the history. And I identify. I mean, I do discuss it in the book. I also mention you and your intervention as a daughter of Holocaust survivors working within that space. I also observe in the book through kind of the ethnography and the interviews that there is an issue about the intergenerational tension. So I think you're really highlighting a very important site of contention, because I observed often kind of a rejection of the older generation, including of the people who populated that space of civil rights work and the peace movement for their for them not being sufficiently reflexive regarding their own whiteness or Ashkenazi dominance, and so this is a real issue about that generational and intergenerational issue, and it also relates to another pattern that I observed within the kind of the youth. Although you see that they are seeking out elders, from kind of the older days to come and, be in conversation with them. But there is also a sense of we are like the generation that will bring kind of the emancipation, the liberation, after the generation in the wilderness that are still kind of like enslaved within the mentality, kind of the Eurocentric mentality. So we are the generation that will be, will bring this. So I think you're really highlighting a very important issue, and with respect to the second point, you kind of highlighted the whether it's an either or, and this is a conversation that I also had with Brant relatively recently about when I trace the Jewish Palestine solidarity activists. I also illuminate what are the mechanisms for their own process of politicization, and often it involves a whole lot of politicization on other issues like feminism, like issues of gender and sexuality, anti-militarism broadly, and through that they kind of like have to resolve the cognitive dissonance that they experience, and that process involves challenging those binaries of that kind of inform modernity and modernist thinking, except the one binary of Zion versus diaspora. Mm-hmm. And therefore I brought the story of how Efrat Yordei was this Ethiopian activist it was actually in a Jewish Voice for Peace panel with the Movement for Black Lives. And she articulated the point where she said, I get your critique and you take me in to your movement because I'm Black. But can you also take me in, and can you also understand my family yearning in Ethiopia, my family yearning to Zion. It's not the Eurocentric, like she gets the analysis of the Eurocentric, internalized anti-Semitism and the kind of the ethnocentric logic of nationalism that became, Zionism. She gets it, but she also said, how can we also integrate? How can I also be Jewish and Black within that space? So this really highlights an important point. And of course, I have to own my own situatedness. I'm Israeli, I'm Jewish, and so I've participated in the spaces of American Jewish Palestine solidarity, but I didn't always feel, fully in those places because of the push to think also, not only about American Jews and their sense of like coherence with their Jewishness, but also about the people on the ground, and so those tensions I think need to be resolved and or interrogated further to think constructively on the ground about justice and ending the occupation. So I'll end here. And I don't know, maybe Brent, you want to say something about that?
Very quickly, to both of Sarah's points, which I really appreciate. On the issue of the larger historical context, I completely agree. I'll say just personally, when I left my former congregation under very, very painful and traumatic circumstances, the first people to reach out to me were elders. And here I will name people, people like Mark Ellis, who is an academic who has been hugely marginalized as a result of his scholarship on Jewish liberation theology, and a congregational rabbi, Leonard Bierman of blessed memory in Los Angeles, who was able to stand in solidarity with Palestinians in a suburban Los Angeles congregation for his entire adult life. Everett Gendler, another rabbi who pioneered this work. These were three I can think of who, in a very painful moment in my life, reached out to me in a way that meant a great deal. And I think, it's interesting. I'm trying to position myself. I'm starting to feel uncannily like an elder now when I look at a lot of these folks, which is really an unusual place for me to be. But one of the things I am noticing among many young people is I do see, Atalia sort of alluded to it, a desire to find elders who can guide them. And I've seen articles in Jewish Currents, by the way, by young people who have written about Brera, the Jewish American Jewish organization in the early 70s that spoke about speaking to the PLO and other things that were unthinkable at the time and ended up being quashed by the Jewish federations, and a collective here in Chicago called Chutzpah that did similar kinds of work. And I detect a kind of a yearning and a curiosity about the elders, which I find elders in this work, which I find really important and encouraging. The other thing that I'll just say very quickly to your point about finding ways to coexist, I think there is a spectrum in this movement. They're not all anti-Zionist. There are many, particularly in the group, if not now, that really see themselves as playing the inside game, so to speak, and challenging their own community because they want their own community to step up. I did the inside game for many, many years until I found that my proper place was the outside game. But I think in this movement, there is a place for all of those. I believe, at least, there's a place for all of these, that it's not maybe in a very deep, ultimate sense, it's a which side are you on question. I think I do believe that. But from a strategic point of view, in terms of movement building and how best to achieve this end goal, I think we need all hands on deck. And some will be from within the community, some from without, many from within will move toward that place. I was one of them. So anyways, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, no, and one thing I think we all learned way back, talk about feeling like you're an elder, is that it's very important to try to, well, first understand how the people who oppose you feel. where they are coming from. We may not agree with them, we may not share their position, but it's very important to understand what Israel means to them, what Judaism means to them, and how can we find ways to try to, be inclusive. It didn't always work, of course, and when I was starting this work and my colleagues and friends, it was a very different environment. But I think that now there may be more opportunities for that. But at the very least, I think it's exceedingly important that it not become an either or thing, in the sense that we all have positions, of course, and we hold those positions. Hopefully they're based on information and thought and experience, but so do others. And we have to find ways, I think, as a community, as a social movement, however you want to define it, for reaching out to others and building some kind of bridge that would allow us to engage with each other and not just always be opposed to each other.
Yeah, I should say that in the book I trace, through the interviews, people's own process of, shifting, like kind of what Brant described, often going from the liberal Zionist to other positions. Although I speak to a whole spectrum, and many of them talk about the pain, the grieving, of disengaging, of kind of unlearning what they thought they were, and what many people within that movement space know what you are talking about. Understand that it's hard, and even like family dinners are painful, this is something that that I trace. But what I also found interesting is that there was such a high level of critical engagement with this process of unlearning that involved, citing scholars, Edward Said, and in people's, own understanding of their process. And yet, when I asked questions, and I also interviewed about 75 Palestine solidarity activists who are not Jewish, and they had identical responses to the question of how do they see the future of Palestine and Israel, and that kind of I kind of end the book in that place where I say, on the ground in Israel, and Israeli Jews really have to do a different kind of work, and that is more specific, and it also includes kind of specifically Jewish Israeli, that is different. And so I think I kind of I just want to kind of amplify the point that many people understand what people who disagree with them, where they are coming from, because they experienced that, they embodied that place, they inhabited that place too.
First of all, thank you all. It's really, really rich insights and comments. I just want to jump in with also an observation about my experience of both your work through this text, Atalia, and also Brant, your work and yours, Sara. And the thing I just want to highlight is my deep appreciation for living in that complexity. All of you, both in your own work and in your own lives, have really embraced this very difficult space of what it means to be in honest engagement with the tensions of what it means to own a sense of what it means to be Jewish in the contemporary times in which we have all lived, and to wrestle with that in a way with others within a community that is incredibly diverse. And I just want to say, Atalia, your work, you've given tools, and Brant, you articulated this at the outset of your comments, the kind of critical tools of methodological tools, even as frameworks to be able to think about these complexities. And your work, your prophetic pastiche in this text, I thought was just such a rich way to think about these complexities. Your critical caretaking work, which has been carried forward from earlier days of your scholarship, is a similar kind of recognition of the multiple roles of what it means for anyone to take seriously a sense of identity and commitment. It goes well beyond a Jewish framing, but a sense of identity and commitment to then be engaged in a process, recognizing we're all in a process of working toward a vision of an imagination of what is possible. And so that recognition of process, I think, is so key. And then the third is your, again, longstanding work in your language of a hermeneutic of citizenship. What does it mean to belong? Who gets to belong? And to ask those questions. So you're inviting people in a conversation to ask different kinds of questions, which is a very different modus of engagement than it is to insert or assert a certain kind of answer. And that work that you do and that Brant you have done and are doing through your work and with the new congregation and your own movement, and Sara, your long-standing both activism and scholarship have all really done exactly that. You are asking people and inviting people into a conversation that requires participation to imagine a new future with a deep normative sense that itself isn't compromised, but yet is also deepening and unfolding through the process. So I just want to acknowledge those larger gifts that your work, Atalia specifically, but I think both of you have also represented Brant and Sara, and to thank you for that, as someone outside the Jewish community, but sharing the deepest values that you're representing. I am a WASP from the Midwest, and seriously elder too. So here we go. So thank you for that. We've got just a very few minutes here, and we do have a question that I'm gonna from Allison Harvey, and thank you, Allison, for this. I'm gonna invite the consideration again. We just have a few minutes here. Allison says, with the Abraham Agreement being signed by 2 Arab nations, what impact do you see having on the work of Jewish Palestinian activists? And then I'll put out, we've got another one here too from Verana Khoury. How do young Jewish American activists relate to the BDS movement? And if they do, to what extent is it shaping their discourse? So again, I'm gonna just put both of those out there. They're both large questions. If any of you have a brief response, we will need to end right at 1. So I just want to give us that warning, but thank you both. Thank you for those 2 very appropriate questions.
Yeah, I can just say briefly about the BDS, that just like the kind of the spectrum of engagement with the question of Zionism, non-Zionism, and the kind of the critical engagement with Israel, you have variation. Many more people and groups articulated their agreement and participation in BDS movement. So Jewish Voice for Peace is an example. But you have internal conversations and contestation. It's not one thing. So this is one quick answer. Maybe Brant, you want to say something
Sure.
about that?
On the subject of BDS, I mean, and thanks to Atalia, actually, who invited me to speak at the American Academy of Religion and give a paper on BDS as a theological imperative and understanding it as a cry from the oppressed. And the question is, do we respond to a cry from the oppressed the way that God did in the Torah? And so I've written and done a lot of thinking about, again, putting that in a religious context. We also at our congregation before Passover invited Omar Barghouti, one of the founders of the BDS movement, to speak before Passover, to speak about liberation. And, again, being able to do these kinds of things in a Jewish context. It was very important to him to speak in a synagogue. He'd never done it before. And it was very important for us to have him and to learn from him. And these are some examples of the ways that we're trying to reimagine BDS, not just only as a struggle for liberation, but also to understand it as a religious commandment, if you will. I'll just say I think the other question was about the Gulf States treaty with Israel.
Yes.
I'll just say that, well, I don't know, I could express my political opinion about it, but I'm not sure that that's what the questioner was asking. But let's just say for those who see pursuing peace as one of the most central spiritual commandments of our time, I don't see those that agreements that will result in further militarization of the region as advancing the cause for peace.
Sorry. And as many Palestinians have articulated, this is turning the back on Palestinians. Palestinians were not mentioned. So this is indicative of, where we are standing right now. But maybe Sarah can say something about that.
Well, I would also say that, the crux of this conflict is between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and any agreement or action that eliminates Palestinians from the equation is destined to fail, pure and simple. And also, I think it's important to point out that this agreement is not a peace agreement. There was no conflict between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. This is basically an agreement about weapons. It's an agreement about trade. It has nothing to do with peace. And in fact, will probably contribute a great deal to
oppression.
To a process that is quite the opposite of peace.
Mm-hmm.
One final point is that another way to understand this is that these are authoritarian regimes finding common cause with one another. And from a Jewish point of view, we haven't fared well under authoritarian regimes. So that's another way to understand this from a Jewish point of view.
Okay. And we have just one final question, comment really from Evelyn Ophir. Thank you. The problem I have, this is quoting Evelyn, the problem I have is avoiding the situation of building a wall between Israelis and the diaspora. Israel will always be, and maybe the question is how to build a more just shared society in Israel-Palestine where equality and dignity exist for all.
Yeah, I'll just affirm the point that a lot of work has to, the real work, the American Jews have a very important role because of how, they influence the context. And there is also the process of reimagining their own diasporic, the discussion that we had, what does it mean to be, not to be oriented by Zionism as kind of the values. But in Israel, a whole different kind of work, as we alluded to, has to happen. And it kind of captures with what you said, Diane, with this hermeneutics of citizenship, kind of reimagining what it means to be Jewish in that space and not non-hegemonic.
Right. Well, we are against the hour. We're out of time. I just want to say thanks to all three of you for these remarkable comments and this rich discussion. An hour is a very short amount of time. I hope we'll continue these conversations. We will be through other religion, conflict, and peace events. And I'll just close by thanking you, Atalia, again for this really critical and important work. And I just would urge all of you who are in attendance to please to read this and to engage in the questions and the challenges and the opportunities that it really poses, not just for the question of Israel and Palestine and Jewish identity, but again, the implications of this text are wide-ranging, and this becomes an example of ways to think about imagining and solidarity for peaceful coexistence and a just peace in the future in a variety of arenas in our lives. And we know that we need these ideas and this form of hope and imagination and strong vision of justice in these times more than ever. So thank you all. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.